The ceasefire is alive on paper. But in the Strait of Hormuz, the situation is moving in a very different direction. U.S. warships are operating in one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth. Iranian fast boats are now part of the immediate threat picture. Commercial vessels are being seized or challenged, and commanders are making decisions in waters where one bad identification can become the first shot of a much larger war. This is the danger. Nobody has to officially declare the ceasefire dead for the sea to kill it first. This is not just another Middle East flare-up. Hormuz is the narrow maritime corridor connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Roughly one-fifth of the world's oil moves through this passage. That means a naval confrontation here does not stay local. It moves into shipping insurance, fuel prices, inflation data, Asian energy security, European energy planning, and eventually household budgets far from the Gulf. If Hormuz becomes too dangerous to insure, it does not matter whether it is technically open. The official language is still careful. Washington is framing the operation as a limited maritime pressure campaign focused on Iranian ports, Iranian-linked vessels, and coastal movement tied to Tehran. Iran is calling it piracy, coercion, and a violation of the spirit of the ceasefire. But underneath the legal argument is a much simpler reality. Both sides are trying to control what moves through the water without triggering the full war they say they want to avoid. That is what makes this moment so unstable. The United States can pressure Iran by choking off maritime commerce connected to its ports and vessels. Iran can pressure the world by making Hormuz feel unsafe. Neither side has to announce a new war for the crisis to escalate. In a waterway packed with tankers, naval vessels, drones, patrol boats, mine-sweeping operations, and commercial crews just trying to survive the route, escalation can begin with a single nervous decision. The timeline matters. According to the research pack, peace talks collapsed after more than 21 hours of negotiation. Within a day, President Trump ordered a naval blockade connected to Iranian ports and coastal movement. Iran then hardened its posture around Hormuz, and the standoff shifted from negotiation rooms into open water. That shift changed everything. Because once diplomacy moves from conference tables to warships, every message becomes harder to control. Before the blockade, the central question was whether Washington and Tehran could turn a fragile ceasefire into a durable pause. After the blockade, the question became whether either side could back down without looking defeated. That is a much more dangerous question, because military operations create political traps. Once ships are seized, commanders receive new rules of engagement, and both governments start speaking through naval movements. Retreat becomes harder to sell at home. Iran's leverage is geography. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow enough to be threatened by mines, drones, missiles, small boats, shore-based weapons, and simple uncertainty. The U.S. advantage is force projection. Destroyers, aircraft, surveillance, logistics, intelligence, and allied support. But those strengths do not cancel each other out. They collide. One side can dominate militarily. The other can still make the cost of movement painfully high. That is the missing part of the story. A blockade is not just a declaration, it has to be enforced. Every ship has to be identified, tracked, challenged, redirected, searched, delayed, or allowed through. Every action creates a decision point. Every decision point creates risk. And in Hormuz, the distance between pressure and combat can be measured in minutes. What is confirmed is that the United States is trying to restrict Iran's maritime lifelines while keeping the operation framed as controlled and limited. That distinction matters. A blockade or maritime pressure operation focused on Iranian-linked movement is not the same as formally closing the entire Strait of Hormuz, but to commercial shippers, insurers, tanker operators, and energy buyers, the practical effect can still feel similar: uncertainty, delay, risk, and higher costs. Markets do not wait for perfect legal definitions, they price danger first. Iran's response is built around the opposite message. Tehran wants the world to believe that if Iranian trade is threatened, nobody's trade through the Gulf can be treated as completely safe. That does not require Iran to sink tankers or start a full naval war. It only requires enough credible danger to make shipping companies hesitate, insurers raise premiums, and captains question whether the route is worth the risk. In global energy markets, hesitation is expensive. This is why mines matter so much. A mine does not have to explode to change the market. It only has to be believed. Even the suggestion that mines may be present in or near shipping lanes changes behavior. Mine clearing is slow, technical, and psychologically difficult. A waterway does not become safe just because a government says it is safe. It becomes safe when insurers, captains, shipping firms, and energy traders believe the risk has actually fallen. According to current reporting, the U.S. is conducting mine clearing operations in and around the strait. That sounds like a technical detail, but it is strategically important. Mine warfare favors the actor trying to disrupt movement. Mines are cheaper and easier to place than they are to locate and remove. That means Iran does not need naval superiority to create operational problems for a superior navy. It only needs to make the route feel uncertain. Fast boats create a similar problem. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard has long relied on smaller vessels, swarming tactics, and harassment operations in Gulf waters. A fast boat can approach quickly, force a decision, and create ambiguity. Is it observing? Is it threatening? Is it laying mines? Is it baiting a response? Is it testing U.S. rules of engagement? In a crisis like this, ambiguity is not a detail. It is the trigger. That is why the reported authorization involving Iranian boats suspected of laying mines is so consequential. It signals that Washington is trying to deter Iranian disruption before it happens. But deterrence always has a second edge. If Iran believes the United States is looking for an excuse to strike, then every encounter becomes politically charged. A tactical warning can become a strategic provocation, and once a boat is destroyed, the question is no longer what happened at sea. The question becomes who has to answer next. The U.S. position is that it cannot allow Iran to turn Hormuz into a weapon. That argument has real weight. The strait is not just important to America. It is essential to Asian importers, Gulf producers, European energy stability, and global inflation expectations. If Hormuz becomes unstable, the shock does not stop at the shoreline. But Iran's counterargument is equally blunt. If its own ports and vessels are being pressured, why should its rivals continue moving freely? This is the core contradiction of the standoff. Washington wants to isolate Iran without shutting down the global energy system. Tehran wants to resist isolation without inviting overwhelming U.S. military force. Both goals are understandable. Both are hard to sustain, and both depend on controlling events in a place where events have a habit of outrunning political plans. This is exactly the kind of moment where surface-level headlines miss the real danger. If you want calm, disciplined breakdowns of the moves behind the headlines, subscribe to Signal Drop. Because what happens in Hormuz now is not just about who fires first, it is about who loses control first. The pressure is already visible in shipping behavior. When companies even begin to slow, reroute, delay, or reassess traffic through a critical route, markets notice. Shipping companies do not need a formal closure to demand higher rates. Insurers do not need a full naval battle to raise premiums. Energy traders do not wait for certainty. They price risk before the public fully understands it. That is how fear moves faster than oil. That is how a military standoff becomes an economic event. Tankers move slower. Cargoes become harder to schedule. Refineries worry about supply timing. Importers seek alternatives. Governments prepare emergency reserves. Traders build a risk premium into prices before the crisis is even fully understood by the public. None of that looks dramatic on television, but it changes the cost structure of the global economy. Hormuz does not need to be completely shut to hurt. The legal debate also matters, but not in the way most people assume. International law treats blockades as serious acts, especially when they affect neutral shipping. The United States is likely to frame its operation around enforcement, sanctions, security, and wartime necessity. Iran will frame it as illegal coercion. Neutral states will judge it less by legal theory and more by a simpler question: can their ships move safely? That is where Europe enters the picture. European leaders have every reason to support freedom of navigation, but they also have every reason to fear a wider war. France and the United Kingdom can talk about maritime security missions, escorts, and allied coordination. But a multinational effort depends on timing, mandate, risk tolerance, and whether the United States can keep escalation contained. Allied support is never automatic when the water gets hot. Asia has an even sharper problem. China, India, Japan, South Korea, and other major energy importers depend heavily on Gulf energy flows. For them, Hormuz is not an abstract security issue, it is an industrial input. If tankers are delayed, if prices rise, if supplies become uncertain, the consequences move directly into manufacturing, electricity costs, transport prices, political pressure, and inflation. For Asia, Hormuz is not a map point. It is a pressure valve for the economy. This is one reason Iran's threat is powerful even when its navy is weaker. Iran does not need to defeat the U.S. Navy in a conventional fight. It only has to make the world ask whether moving through Hormuz is worth the risk today. That question alone can raise costs, and if enough companies answer no, the disruption becomes real. In this kind of crisis, perceived danger can become operational reality. But Iran is not operating without risk. Threatening Hormuz can create sympathy among some anti-US audiences, but it can also anger countries Iran needs economically. China may dislike U.S. pressure, but China also needs energy flows. India may resist American pressure, but India also needs stable imports. Gulf states may fear escalation, but they also need their exports moving. Iran's leverage works only as long as it does not turn potential partners into frustrated customers. Washington faces a similar trap. A blockade can look strong at first. It shows action. It creates pressure. It gives the administration a visible tool short of direct invasion or major airstrikes. But enforcement is the hard part. If too many ships slip through, the blockade looks weak. If enforcement becomes too aggressive, the blockade risks becoming the war. That is the trap. Strength has to be visible, but not uncontrollable. That is why warnings about enforcement difficulty matter. A blockade sounds clean in political language. In practice, it requires ships, aircraft, intelligence, legal screening, boarding teams, coordination with allies, and constant judgment calls. The Gulf is not an empty chessboard. It is one of the busiest and most sensitive maritime zones in the world. Every vessel has a flag, every cargo has an owner, every delay has a buyer, every boarding has a diplomatic consequence, and every mistake has an audience. The danger increases because the ceasefire itself appears fragile. A ceasefire can pause missile strikes and large-scale operations, but it does not automatically resolve enforcement, sanctions, ship seizures, maritime access, or military presence. In other words, the war may be paused on one layer while continuing on another. That is not peace. That is conflict by controlled pressure. Controlled pressure can work if both sides understand the limits. The problem is that the limits are now being tested publicly. The U.S. is signaling that Iranian disruption around mines, fast boats, and shipping lanes can trigger a military response. Iran is signaling that maritime pressure on Iran will produce maritime pressure on everyone else. Those are not just negotiating positions anymore. They are operational warnings. There is also a domestic political layer. For Trump, backing down from a blockade after ordering it would invite accusations of weakness. For Iran's leadership, reopening Hormuz or reducing pressure while Iranian-linked shipping remains restricted could look like surrender. That makes compromise harder. The battlefield is water, but the audience is domestic power. This is where the story becomes more serious than a simple US-Iran confrontation. The incentives are misaligned. The world wants shipping restored. Washington wants pressure maintained. Tehran wants pressure reversed. Energy importers want stability. Gulf states want protection without becoming targets. Allies want coordination without being dragged into a war. Every actor wants a different version of de-escalation. That is why the standoff is so difficult to unwind. The clearest analytical payoff is this: the side with the stronger navy does not automatically control the outcome. The United States can dominate the surface battle, intercept vessels, escort ships, threaten Iranian boats, and project overwhelming force. But Iran can still influence the risk environment, and in Hormuz, perceived danger can matter almost as much as physical control. That is the uncomfortable lesson. Power controls the sea, fear controls the price of using it. That is the hidden cost of the blockade strategy. Washington may be able to hurt Iran economically, but the act of doing so can push Iran toward the exact asymmetric tools that make global markets nervous: mines, drones, seizures, harassment, ambiguous warnings, temporary disruptions, fast boat encounters, threats that may or may not become action. All of these tools turn pressure on Iran into pressure on everyone who uses the Gulf. The administration's challenge is to convince markets and allies that the blockade is precise, controlled, and temporary. Iran's challenge is to convince those same audiences that the blockade is reckless, illegal, and destabilizing. This is not just a naval contest. It is a contest over which narrative becomes the operating assumption for governments, insurers, and shippers. Because once insurers believe a route is unstable, speeches do not move tankers. Confidence does. If Washington wins that narrative, Iran looks like the spoiler threatening global commerce. If Tehran wins it, the United States looks like the power that turned a fragile ceasefire into an economic shock. That perception matters, because the longer the standoff lasts, the more neutral countries will pressure both sides to explain why their strategy is worth the global cost. And the longer the cost rises, the harder that explanation becomes. The risk is not that either side wakes up wanting uncontrolled war. The risk is that each side believes it can manage one more step, one more seizure, one more warning shot, one more interception, one more fast boat challenge, one more mine-clearing operation near contested waters, one more public threat meant to deter the other side. Wars often expand not because leaders choose the worst outcome, but because they misprice the next move. This is especially true in maritime crises. At sea, commanders often act before presidents can calculate political consequences. A radar track looks hostile, a boat keeps approaching, a boarding team meets resistance, a drone is misidentified, a mine is discovered near a transit lane. Each incident may have a tactical explanation, but the strategic interpretation comes later, and by then, the damage may already be done. That is why the fast boat issue is the tripwire to watch. Clearer authority can reduce hesitation for U.S. commanders, but reducing hesitation also reduces the time available for de-escalation in the moment. If an Iranian boat is destroyed, Tehran will face pressure to answer. If Tehran answers, Washington will face pressure to escalate. That is the latter, and in Hormuz, the first rung may be only minutes away. And if this kind of breakdown is useful, stay with Signal Drop, subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks Hormuz is just another headline from far away. Because the real story is not only whether the strait stays open, it is whether the world's most important energy corridor can remain open while the countries around it are already acting like the ceasefire is half dead. The uncomfortable truth is that neither side has a clean victory available. The United States can tighten pressure, but pressure can spread into the global economy. Iran can disrupt shipping, but disruption can isolate it further. Both can claim they are defending their rights. Both can say the other side started it. But tankers, insurers, and energy markets do not care who writes the better statement. They care about whether the route is usable. That is the real scoreboard. Not speeches, not threats, not legal memos, not televised warnings, not carefully worded statements about restraint, safe passage, predictable insurance, stable energy flows. If those do not return, then the blockade has already changed the conflict, even if no one officially declares that the ceasefire has collapsed. A ceasefire that cannot protect shipping is not a stable ceasefire. It is a pause with engines running. The next phase will depend on three things. First, whether mine-clearing operations can restore confidence faster than Iran can create doubt. Second, whether U.S. commanders can enforce the blockade without triggering a direct clash. And third, whether Iran decides that controlled disruption gives it more leverage than reopening the strait under pressure. Those three questions will decide whether this remains a standoff or becomes something harder to contain. Diplomacy is still possible, but it now has to solve more than the original dispute. It has to address ship seizures, blockade enforcement, maritime guarantees, sanctions pressure, mine clearing, freedom of navigation, and the political need for both sides to claim they did not retreat. That is a much heavier negotiation than the one that collapsed before the blockade began. Because now, diplomacy is not just trying to stop escalation, it is trying to reverse facts already created at sea. The broader consequence is that Hormuz has become a test of modern coercion. Can a superpower use naval pressure surgically in a crowded global economy? Can a regional power resist without overplaying its hand? Can markets absorb a controlled crisis in the one place they fear most? None of those questions have easy answers, and the problem with Hormuz is that the market may answer before diplomats do. For now, the standoff sits in a dangerous middle zone. Not full war, not real peace, not open shipping with full confidence, not total closure. That middle zone can last for days, maybe weeks, if discipline holds. But it can also collapse quickly if one captain, one commander, one patrol boat, one drone, or one mine turns a managed crisis into an uncontrollable one. This is the kind of crisis where the world does not need a declaration. The Strait of Hormuz has always been narrow, but now the margin for error is even narrower. The United States is trying to squeeze Iran without breaking the global energy system. Iran is trying to resist without inviting a devastating response. Commercial ships are trying to move through a corridor where politics, oil, mines, and military orders now overlap. And between them sits the old lesson every major power eventually relearns: geography still rules.